Welcome back to Bold Dominion, a state news explainer podcast for a changing Virginia. This week, we're going to talk about roads, and I thought it might be interesting to start with a little trivia. So I pulled two of my coworkers, Dan Henneke and Jay Baker, into the studio to test their roads knowledge. Are you all ready?
We are.
Sure thing.
Okay. So, first question. Virginia has a population of about 8.7 million people. How many cars do you think are registered with the Virginia DMV?
You want to go first, Dan?
Sure. I will say 3.2 million.
I feel like it's a lot. I'm going to say 20 million.
Okay, I love the spread on these. It is in the middle of those. It is 8.4 million. So there's about one vehicle per person in Virginia. And it seems like that's pretty typical. I looked at some other states. It's not out of line.
Yeah, it's better than I expected. I was thinking double.
Yeah. Okay, so this next one is really hard. So I'm going to give you a hint at the end. So how many miles of public roads are there in Virginia? And the hint is that it is in the tens of thousands.
Jay, why don't you take this one first?
Sure, I'm doing some thinking. The tens of thousands. So between 10,000 and 100,000.
Yeah.
I bet there are 72,000 miles of roads.
Okay.
That is the exact number in my head, so that is very
Really?
strange. But yes.
Okay, and you both are so close. It's 75,508 miles
I'm proud of that one.
as of 2022. So just to put that in context, if you drove from Virginia Beach to San Francisco, guess what that distance is?
It's like 2,000 miles.
Yeah, it's only 3,000 miles. So, and we have 75,000 miles of roads in Virginia. That one kind of blew my mind, but y'all were spot on. I'm impressed. Okay, last question. So the whole Virginia state budget in 2023 was about $81 billion. What percentage of that do you think went to VDOT, the Department of Transportation?
Tell me the whole budget one more time.
$81 billion.
I'll go with 8%.
I'm going to go with 3.
Okay, it's a little higher. It is 11%.
It's better than expected.
So a pretty good amount. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so now that we all have some new fun facts, let's get into the main question here. How are roads in Virginia built and maintained? And to answer that, I sat down with Michael Barnes. He's the director of planning for Albemarle County, and he's worked in planning, including transportation planning, in Virginia for over 20 years. And he is truly a font of knowledge. Okay, so to start off, roads are built and maintained by a variety of entities. Can you kind of describe the different groups involved in our road infrastructure?
Sure. There's two major drivers for how roads get built. Part of it's done by the private sector when they're building a subdivision or something like that. And other roads, typically larger roads, are built by the state. Some are built by localities, depending on, especially if they're an independent city. But the majority, I'd say, the roads that you see are built by private developers.
I think that might kind of surprise people. Could you give some examples of roads that are built by private developers?
Well, all the roads that you're going to be seeing on most private subdivision streets are built by developers. These days, VDOT's mostly widening roads. There are very few times that they're building a new road on a new alignment.
Mm-hmm. And what about, like a strip mall or those kinds of developments?
Sure. Well, obviously the strip mall itself is built by the site plan, and they're doing that. But getting to the strip mall, oftentimes the private developer is the one who's paying for any improvements at their entrance, or maybe they're paying for some widening associated with the traffic that shopping mall is going to generate.
Okay, so that's just a little bit about our existing road infrastructure. But can you talk about how new projects get started?
So, and we're talking about here public sector new projects, ones that are built by VDOT or by localities. I think there's probably 4 steps to planning a project. The first step is the planning of it. And there's a lot of processes that either happen at the state level or at a regional level with a regional planning body, or at a locality that sort of picks that as a project it wants to be sort of done at some point in the future. But you can have a long list of those projects if you look at a lot of these plans. So the second step is really trying to pick the right projects. And typically that's done on certain funding cycles at the state, who's the primary funder of a lot of the roads. Then the third step is engineering and actually constructing the project. And the fourth step is going to be maintaining the project at some point in the future.
So let's go through each of those steps in a little bit more detail one by one. We start with the kind of long-range planning. So how do localities make decisions about what their road infrastructure needs are?
Well, a lot of localities have two major ways they're doing that. The first, the state's divided up into these regional planning bodies or planning districts. Here in Central Virginia, we have the Thomas Jefferson Planning District. And they'll do a lot of long-range planning, modeling, sort of like understanding where our needs of congestion needs to be resolved, or accommodating other modes of travel, bus or pedestrian or bike travel. So that's a lot of where that new project happens at the local level. There are localities, Albemarle, for example, will do sort of transportation planning to try and meet its own needs. You might end up with dozens of projects that might be something that you want to build over the long term. Eventually, they end up on a list, and that list is either a constrained list or an unconstrained list. And so this constrained list, this is within the more urban areas, the metropolitan planning areas. In those areas, it's constrained lists. The project has to be on that and get voted by the electeds who want to see it move forward before it'll actually really start to become something that's eligible for a funding application.
What takes something from the unconstrained list to the constrained list?
Well, so that unconstrained list, they're looking at a wider array of potential solutions. So the constrained list is usually stuff that A, has some political support, B, meets some specified criteria of safety and other objectives that the region is really trying to advance.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's much citizen input at this level?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of citizen input that happens at all levels. In this early planning stage, it's everything from people who volunteer to be on these regional bodies and become active citizen planners to public hearings that will be held on individual projects or adoptions of these plans, these types of things, where people can come and sort of weigh in on what they think about the plan in general or projects in specific.
You've mentioned this a little bit, but what would you say are like the major factors that are considered at this step? Is it, safety? Is it traffic? Is it projected growth?
Yes, it's all of those things. Safety, growth, congestion. The MPO that I work in here in Central Virginia has picked 5 criteria, and projects will be weighted against them. And those are things like safety, congestion, and some of it also is like looking towards non-car type solutions too, whether they are multimodal, bike ped, or transit type of solutions. Those can be a factor in weighting projects that move forward.
So let's talk a little bit more about this prioritization project, right? So you mentioned the unconstrained list and the constrained list, and then how does that get narrowed down to projects that are going to get funded?
So ultimately, we move into that sort of second step, like let's pick a project that we're going to do. We've got a group of projects we know we might want to do, and they can start in a couple of different ways. They might start with a VDOT study. Projects may start with their STARS, which is a strategically targeted affordable roadway solutions program, or Project Pipeline, which is another project that they have in the state for dealing with projects that the state's identified as high priorities. So those are often places where a lot of road projects will start. Mm-hmm. A lot of bike ped projects start mostly from the locality. VDOT will fund those, but those kind of start there. And then a lot of the transit projects are starting with the Department of Rail and Transportation, and again, these regional planning bodies like the PDCs.
Okay, so once a project has been selected, where does the money for it come from?
So if you move out of the first step of planning the projects, and now you're trying to pick the project that you want to do, the state has a biannual funding cycle. The larger pot of money is Smart Scale, and the smaller pots of money, there's a range of them, but a lot of them are revenue sharing projects or transportation alternative projects, and they work on opposite years. So what will happen is, in the year the Smart Scale project is going on, localities and VDOT will work with a lot of public participation to try and develop what the project is going to be, what its scope is, and then try and work out a really good cost estimate to try and figure out how much that project might cost. And those become the fundamental components of the application. Same thing with the revenue sharing and the TAP programs, but the idea is that eventually they will be sort of ranked by VDOT through a system where they're really trying to, it's called Smart Scale, and the idea of a Smart Scale is to sort of take some of the politics out of picking road projects and to try and find projects that can meet quantitative goals of safety, congestion reduction, economic development, helping bike ped safety and all these multimodal transportation. Those get ranked, and ultimately there is the Commonwealth Transportation Board, or the CTB, who picks the projects. So once a project's picked and they select those, they'll move forward with funding towards the engineering construction phase.
How were projects selected before Smart Scale?
The real paradigm shift was that before, when projects were thought about being funded, the state would put a little bit of money, and it put a little bit of money on a lot of different projects, and they all sort of moved forward in this sort of a planning stage and a partial engineering stage, and they probably would spend a lot of money on some of the engineering before they really decided that this is a project they want to move forward. And as a result, we had lots of partially funded projects that were waiting to be built, or maybe they decided this was a good idea to build, but then they just didn't have enough money to actually go to construction. So these things would languish for years. And the state just brought this Smart Scale process in, and the idea was to sort of rework the process where, hey, we're going to pick a project. If it ranks high enough and meets enough of our metrics, we're going to fully fund it and move it forward. Oftentimes, those projects previously, some of the ways they would move forward is if politics moved them forward. So this one's more based on the merits of the project.
Interesting. And when was Smart Scale introduced in Virginia?
I think Smart Scale was created in 2014.
Is this a process that other states were already using? Like, how did we come up with a whole new system for this?
Well, I'm a little bit blind on like its history and why it came, but my understanding it is relatively innovative with other states, trying this process of like really creating a strong metric, using big data, using like projects to weigh against each other to sort of see which one makes for the best project is kind of innovative for the state. Of course, Virginia is also an interesting state. In the state of Virginia, VDOT maintains majority of the roads. A lot of other states, the states only maintain the major highways or interstates, and localities and other entities maintain the streets to drive on. So Virginia is innovative in that regard.
So we've been talking about public sector projects mostly, and we'll keep talking about public sector projects, but what about roads that are built by the private sector? Do they need to go through approval processes? Are they working with the state?
Most private projects are worked through the locality. They're reviewed by the state, but the actual application for the road either comes in through a subdivision, and mostly subdivision plats. Somebody subdividing the land to create a residential subdivision or maybe even a commercial subdivision. And it's going to be a publicly maintained road eventually. But the money behind building the road and the money paying for the engineering to design the road is all funded by the private sector. Mm-hmm. It's reviewed by the locality and by VDOT and ultimately approved. The private developers who builds it, eventually it gets inspected and deemed to be acceptable to be brought into the state's transportation system, and at that point it would be publicly maintained afterwards.
Okay, so back to the public sector. A project has been planned, it's been selected, it's been funded. How does it actually get built?
Well, I mean, we can get into the details of various different processes that build it, but I don't think that's as important as to say, usually these things the public sector will get the project engineered, and then they will hire a contractor. Almost always, most of these big projects are built by private contractors who are hired by the state. And the process can take several years to get through. Typically speaking, it probably takes 4 to 5 years to design and build a project. That's after it's been funded. So when we're really talking about a timeline here, again, you go back to the first step of the planning, that process can take several years or sometimes longer. And sometimes projects can stay on a plan sheet for years and years. Actually picking the project, developing the funding application, that usually takes 6 to 8 to 12 months. And then after it's funded to construct it, we're probably talking 2 years to engineer the project, sometimes 3, and then however long it takes to build the project. Some projects are built in a year, and some projects can take several years to build.
Do you think the speed of that process is good and deliberative, or do you think it's burdensome? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
There are multiple different ways to deliver a project. And the typical way of doing is to engineer it and then put it out for a competitive bid and then have a contractor build it. And that process can take a little bit longer than a new process that they're really trying to work on, where it's called design build. And in that perspective, the state actually hires a team of a designer and a builder. And those projects can actually be delivered much more quickly than the other process. Sometimes the cost differences depends on the situation. It depends on the project. But those can be built quicker, and we've seen that in some of the projects here in Central Virginia.
Do you have any examples of projects that kind of be a good example of this 4-step process?
Again, there's several different ways that projects can be delivered. They can be done through this design build process, where the state engineers the project and creates a design document that goes out to bid, and then a private contractor would build that. And I'm thinking of a roundabout project that is here in Charlottesville, actually in Albemarle County, out on 5th Street. They're trying to put a roundabout. Now, there's a project that was thought about through a STARS study. They did the 5th Street corridor and talked about along that corridor a series of projects that might be necessary to bring safety and increase mobility and all the things we're looking for with the project. What they decided at the end was at the intersection of 5th Street and Old Lynchburg Road that they would build a roundabout. So the state has gone through, it went through a smart scale process. It was ranked competitively. It ranked high enough that it would get funded. And the state Department of Transportation and their engineering division did the design for the roundabout at this intersection. That process will probably go to construction next year. And the process from when they did the STAR study until now has probably been about 5 years. And it'll go to construction in a year, and it'll probably take about 18 months to build.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that brings us to the last step, which is super important, and that's maintenance. So you hinted at this a little bit, but who is responsible for maintaining which roads?
So in the state of Virginia, the maintenance is really broken into 2 major ways. Independent cities typically own their own roads. They receive some money from the state in the form of urban payments, but they do all the maintenance on their streets. The remaining part of the states, most of the counties, VDOT does the maintenance. There are a few exceptions of counties. Henrico and Alexandria maintain their own roads.
What are some of the most common maintenance projects that people might see?
Well, I think the most common that most people are going to see is just paving or mowing of the grass, replacement of signs. Those are a lot of the ones that you would see on every day. But maintenance itself is a whole art. To maintain a road, the systems the state has in place, a lot of the engineering and a lot of the program management they do really are kind of innovative in their way that they maintain the roads. I mean, there's all kinds of pavement management programs. I mean, sometimes you'll see these trucks that are driving around. They've got all these sensors and stuff that are hanging off the truck. They're actually going along and getting real-time data of the highway, everything from how many cracks does the pavement have, or what's the condition of the sidewalks, or is there vegetation too close to the road? And they can integrate a lot of that data into maintenance programs that they have to do. Of course, one of the biggest drivers of maintenance is going to be citizen complaints. People outside are seeing something that's, doesn't work in their neighborhood or on the road they drive. Those complaints filter through to VDOT, and that's one of the major ways that those things get maintained.
Is it expensive to maintain our roadways?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there is something certainly to be said for a road that's well maintained. Roads that get older, they form cracks in them, water starts to infiltrate, they freeze, thaw, they crack more, and you can get to a point where a road gets so dilapidated that it actually has to be completely rebuilt. starts to change the sub base, the stone that's underneath that supports the asphalt. And when that happens, it can be very expensive. So yeah, it's cheaper to try and stay on top of maintenance as best as possible. And of course, there's this whole trade-off of having enough money to maintain as much as you can with a growing inventory of roads in the state. That makes it a challenging operation.
What sorts of factors contribute to road wear and tear?
Things that contribute to road wear and tear, obviously the environment. Roads in the north where they have lots of salt and lots of freeze-thaw are going to be harder to maintain than a road in the south where it's warmer and they don't have that. But certainly heavy traffic, trucks that are beyond their weight limits, and just the sheer volume of traffic on a road will wear it down.
What would you say is a common misconception that people have about roadways or traffic?
That they own the parking space in front of their house. No. It's funny how people look at congestion. I mean, most of the time they experience it during this peak hour when everybody's trying to get to work in the morning or get home in the afternoon, or when everybody's shopping on Saturday. A lot of the times, if you go outside peak hours, the roads aren't that congested. And I think one of the misconceptions that people have is that we need to make our roads wider to handle that peak hour traffic. And it may be managing that transportation demand and trying to move that to different forms of transit or biking during the peak hours allows for the road infrastructure to accommodate the traffic and can be significant savings as opposed to constantly trying to widen the roads, which then leads to people living farther out and more congestion and more traffic. Oftentimes, I think that people don't realize that just adding another lane, that it's going to be filled up in a few years. And so widening roads isn't always the solution.
Has COVID and changing working patterns had an impact on transportation planning?
COVID has been an interesting thing, and I'm not quite sure we fully understand the ramifications of COVID. It's interesting on my drive into work, I come in on a road that's fairly new, and it's funny, Tuesdays, it's really congested. But Friday, it's almost never congested. And I think there's an interesting thing how it is.
Tuesday is a big work in the office day. Anecdotal evidence, but I know a lot of people whose in-office day is Tuesday.
Right. So if I can get you to ride your bus, local bus line on Tuesday, you're going to be helping out everybody.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you think that the planning process is super different in rural parts of the state versus urban, suburban? Or is it similar?
No, it's a good question. Virginia's lots of different components to it. You have very much the urban crescent, the stuff that goes from Northern Virginia to Richmond down to the Tidewater area, and it has its whole host of problems. Here in Central Virginia, our traffic planning is built around safety because of a lot of the rural roads, but the few cities that we have, we're dealing with that congestion problems or safety problems. If you move out to the western part of the state, southwestern part of the state, a lot of the road planning is about economic development. It makes sense too. I mean, transit has to have a certain amount of density and closeness of people to make it work. The farther the people live from their destination and the more spread out they are, the harder it is to provide transit for people like that. Not that it shouldn't be done, but it's just harder to do that and provide an effective service.
This is a very specific kind of pet interest question, but I know Richmond has introduced bus-only rapid transit lanes. Are there other parts of the state that are looking into that?
So bus rapid transit is kind of what it sounds like. And the idea behind it is that you're trying to get a bus service that's coming very frequently, and it has often its own dedicated lanes, or at least if it comes up to an intersection, there's a signal preemption, which means the bus can move through it. And the idea is to try and move those buses as quicker than traffic. And that may also mean special branding to try and attract people to it, as well as special stops that allow people to quickly get on and off the bus. There are bus rapid transit lanes in Northern Virginia, and I believe that the Tidewater area is looking at them. It's something that would interest us here in Central Virginia. Again, it's trying to have adequate density to really try and make those things an effective tool. Hopefully we're working in that direction.
Can you think of any projects in Virginia in the last few years that were like especially innovative that you just think are really cool?
On one level, watching them build the widening of I-66 has been an amazing project. It was a design build project, and it looked like it was like 15 different construction projects. There was like every mile you went down, there was a whole new team of contractors, the same contractor, but building that road. And it was amazing how quickly they did that.
And that's I-66 in Northern Virginia?
I-66 in Northern Virginia, the widening of that. We can talk about the merits of that as a separate aspect, but from just a purely building a road, that was pretty fantastic. There are lots of other, I think, innovative projects that VDOT is doing, localities are doing, that are geared towards maybe some more innovative stuff with, again, transit and trying to develop parts of cities. Again, from a traffic management standpoint here in Central Virginia, we've seen some of these DDIs, or diverging diamond interchange projects, that have been built. It's a way of being able to use the constrained right-of-way that these projects have in an innovative way to reduce the number of turning movements and make the signals more efficient, and thus moving more traffic through those interchanges.
Yeah, and there's some examples of those, particularly along I-64.
Several of those on I-64. Yeah. Roundabouts used to be considered innovative too, and we're seeing more and more of those. And of course, they have to be carefully balanced and designed so that pedestrians and bicyclists can use them safely. But it's a solution I think we're going to see more and more.
Why? What's good about roundabouts compared to intersections?
Two major things that help with the roundabouts. First, safety. You don't have as many turning movements. In a typical intersection, there's multiple turning movements. And with a roundabout, it can be much safer, and also traffic doesn't stop, so it can keep flowing around. I think we've seen that in a couple of the hydraulic intersections. Very interesting place to sit and watch that one and see the amount of traffic that's flowing through that right now.
What are some barriers to road improvement projects that are common?
So common barriers to road projects, and things are getting more and more expensive these days, is the capacity to get right-of-way for projects. Land values in our country are going up steeply, and that means that when you need to buy more right-of-way for a road, it becomes very expensive and very quick. Another interesting thing that I think is coming a little bit out of the period with the COVID, as well as probably back always to the Great Recession in 2007, is there's not as many contractors out there to help build the roads. And so that's kind of helped push up prices too. So it's interesting, there's several challenges. Road construction has gotten much more expensive over the past few years, and it's harder to build new roads, which is in part a good idea for, I think, localities to transition, if they can, to other forms of transportation, multimodal transit and biking.
And do you see the state allocating more funds to try and meet those higher prices, or does it just mean that fewer projects are getting funded?
I think it's a combination of both. They really are putting a little bit more money, and I think we'll see fewer projects getting built.
It's sort of a question, but I'm just curious how planners think about this. So when I'm running, walking on my bike, sometimes it really does feel like the cars are out to get me. When y'all are thinking about road projects or improvements or just planning in general, how do planners think about different types of people using the roads?
Definitely, planners are going to approach the planning of roads and the design of roads probably wider than sometimes a traffic engineer would. A traffic engineer who's interested in, typically and historically, been interested in moving as many cars through a street as possible, sometimes didn't prioritize other modes of transportation. It's changed a lot. It's still, I think one of the things is we're still living with the legacy of a more car-centric design. So rebuilding roads and readapting them to other modes of transportation is a very expensive proposition and difficult to do. Again, sometimes within the amount of right-of-way we have, almost impossible to do. So there is this tension of planners trying to create this new world that would be supporting of other forms of transportation, and being sometimes hemmed in by things that are as simple as it's just not practical. You don't have enough room, or you don't have enough money to make them happen. So I think as planners, we need to be very strategic in how we pick solutions to try and gain the most benefit possible.
Mm-hmm. And, I'm hearing a lot about how cars are getting bigger. vehicles that, you and I could just go out and buy. Is that something that y'all are thinking about or seeing effects of?
I think there is stuff that you'd see in the literature talking about that. But from like a public sector planner, obviously we have to deal with many factors that are beyond our control. So people's preference for cars or what Detroit's willing to build for cars is something we just have to sort of work with. We can't really always design around. I mean, that's a kind of a lame answer. I'll come back and sort of say this. It's like for urban planners trying to do that way, we have to recognize that. And there are designs that we can implement to try to slow down traffic, roundabouts, other things like this, to try and traffic calm the street. Again, these can be very expensive solutions. So you have to be able to ration your solutions against a very large problem set of a lot of streets that maybe are more car-centric than we would like them to be.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate you having me. It was a great talk with you about this.
Michael Barnes is the Director of Planning for Albemarle County, Virginia. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us about this. I also want to thank our assistant producer, Sarah Bastinelli, for help with research and editing on this episode. You can find more Bold Dominion episodes at bolddominion.org or wherever else fine podcasts are served. Don't forget to subscribe. It's only a click away. Thank you, and we'll be back in 2 weeks.